Good morning. Glad everybody's here this morning. I hope everybody had a good week. Are there any prayer requests before we begin this morning? I know Jason and Shannon are over in Europe visiting their daughter, I believe, so we want to remember them. What? Where'd you say they went? Europe. Visiting their daughter. I'm not sure what country it is. France. So she's studying and working over there. So, yeah, they'll be gone. I believe it's almost 2 weeks or so. Let's begin with prayer. Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this morning that you've given us. We thank you for the sunshine that we have. We thank you that the seasons are changing. We can see the newness of life starting to sprout through the trees and all the animals coming back out. Father, we're so grateful for this time we can study your word, that we can grow closer to you. Father, we ask that you be with those who are struggling with illnesses and sicknesses. We ask you to restore their health. Be with the doctors and nurses who are administering to them. Be with the Swegglers as they're traveling. Give them a safe journey and bring them back safely to us. In Jesus' name, amen. We wrapped up chapter 5 last week, and we saw the fall of Babylon. I talked mainly about the Medes and the Persians, how big and what type of people they were. So we know that we got a king that's coming in that's on the surface doesn't appear to be a bad guy in Darius. We're going to see a little more about him in chapter 6, and that's where we're going to begin this morning. Is there any questions on anything that we have covered since we started the book of Daniel here? Anything clarified on, or are we just ready to keep digging into this? Let's move on. Chapter 6, we'll read the first 3 verses and talk about that for a few minutes. Now remember, Babylon has just been taken over by the Medes and Persians, and Darius is the king that is in charge. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps of the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, that the king might not suffer loss. Then Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and the satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over their entire kingdom. Just like in any government or any nation that gets conquered by somebody else, and we even see that today in our government. When we get a new president, what happens? He wipes out the old cabinet and brings in the new. When a kingdom is conquered, you don't want the old rulers and their people in charge. You wipe out the old, you bring in your people. And since Babylon is where Darius was basically the king over charge, not the whole Babylonian empire, his father Cyrus over that, Darius is bringing in, he brought in, as we see in chapter verse 1, 120 satraps. These are provincial leaders. They're like governors. So they're over smaller areas in the old capital of Babylon. And this allows Darius to not have to be in charge of all the people. Now he's only got to look out for 120 people, these guys. But instead of looking out for 120 people, he puts 3 people in charge of those 120. So now having to, instead of watching over this whole city, then 120, now he's got 3 people that's reporting to him of what's going to be happening on. And as we see, Daniel's one of these people. And to me, it's interesting and exciting that Daniel's one of these people because remember, Daniel's still a captive. He was a captive when he was, put in the cabinet under Nebuchadnezzar. He's still a captive now, even though some things have changed a little bit under Darius, but he's still a captive. But yet he's in charge of a group of these satraps. He's an integral part of this new government that's coming in place. Now the satraps, I'm going to back up a little bit, they had 3 duties. One of the duties was collecting taxes. Makes sense. You get a new ruler in place, you got to collect taxes, you got to keep things going, you got to keep the money rolling in. They're responsible for security of their little area that they're in charge of. You don't want unruliness, you don't want disruption. So they've got their local so-called police force. And the satraps, they had the supreme judicial authority over that area. So they were the judge in charge, so to speak. So they're collecting money, keeping the peace, and have ruling over when there's something going on. Now, we got 3 people over all these 120. So in this capital, the old capital of Babylon, taxes are being collected, the peace is being kept, and there's authority over there to keep, peace and quiet going on. And all these three commissioners, which Daniel was one, are now reporting to Darius. And their job was to keep these 120 people honest. And we know in today's government places, it wasn't common on back then, when you put somebody in charge, you are going to have at least one or two corrupt people. That's why you got somebody else above you to keep an eye on them, to make sure things are going the way they should be going. And in verse 2, we see that these three commissioners, which Daniel was one, they're in charge to make the satraps accountable to them, that the king might not suffer loss. What kind of loss would this king have if these satraps didn't do their job? Well, somebody would lose their head, but what would the king lose? Not the people, but the king. The king could lose money. Whether the satraps weren't doing their job and collecting the taxes from everybody. If we were the people, then we had somebody coming in, all you guys are paying taxes and I'm not paying taxes. Well, the king's not getting my money. Well, we could all be paying taxes, including me, but the satrap says, I'm just going to keep a tenth of it for me. King, here's all your money. Corrupt political officials, that don't happen. It happened back then, it happens today. That's why this extra rule of authority was put in place, which was these three commissioners. Unfortunately for some, Daniel was one of these commissioners. And we know what kind of person Daniel has. He's shown his character throughout the book so far, that he is a righteous man, he's faithful to God, he's a man of good character. And all those characteristics had to be one of the reasons that Darius put Daniel in that position. Daniel had to make a reputation. Daniel's reputation spoke for itself for what he did under Nebuchadnezzar and everybody else. It had to be out there. Word had to go, and people had to know who Daniel was. Because he was under Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most powerful kings at the time, word got around who Daniel was, I'm sure. Yes, they didn't have the internet, but word got around. And when Darius came into power, he knew who the political officials were. He knew who the government people were. He had to know a little bit about Daniel and his character, who he believed in, who he followed. There had to be that going around, in my opinion. There's nothing in my notes. There's nothing in the commentators that I read that can prove this for sure, but it's just common sense that Darius had some inside knowledge about Daniel because of Daniel's reputation of how an honest and a good character man he was, which would in turn put him into that position. And Daniel being in that position, I'm confident he stayed faithful to God, and he prayed each and every day that he could be the best he could be in that position. Yes, Daniel was faithful to God throughout his whole time here. But in doing that, he also, we're allowed, be loyal to his king. And Daniel was that. Daniel wasn't about to pocket any of the money. He wasn't about to take any of the money that the satraps collected from taxes. Daniel was going to be an honest man, which he was. And in doing so, like under Nebuchadnezzar, what happened? The king saw this. Daniel was distinguishing himself because of the type of person he was. He made a name for himself just by doing the right thing. He wasn't trying to advance his own personal career. Daniel was just doing the right thing. And we see in verse 3 that the king recognizes that, and he knows there's something special about Daniel, and now he wants to put him in charge over the entire kingdom. Daniel's now going to become number 2 over the kingdom that Darius is in charge of. So that's actually kind of better than what Belshazzar said. He said, you are going to be number 3. Cyrus, me, then you. But now Daniel's, even though Darius is the one saying, you are going to be directly under me. I said Cyrus. It was Darius, his father, which was above him. I'm sorry. Belshazzar, his father, which was above him, then Daniel. But this place, it's just Darius and then Daniel. Daniel's reputation stood for itself. The work that he's doing And now he's going to be made number 2 of the kingdom, right underneath the king. And all this didn't happen just in the same day. I'm sure there was time passed that Darius was seeing what Daniel was doing, the quality of his character, and he also had to be seeing what some of the other people were doing, because that's separate in Daniel part. How can he know Daniel's such a good person when there's nothing to compare him to? He's looking at the other people, and he's seeing what Daniel is, and Daniel is setting himself apart from everybody else. How old was Daniel when we first met him back in chapter 1, when he got captured? About 15 years old is when his age. We've had a few stories go through, and at this time, Daniel is about 80 years old. And I come to that because he was captured in approximately 605, and this is roughly 539, which makes 65, 66 years, plus the 15 years of age, 80, 81 years old. So at this point in time, Daniel is about 80 years old when he's getting ready to be made second command under Darius in the Medo-Persian Empire. It's pretty impressive for a man that is still a captive to be in that position. But it's because of Daniel's character and his faithfulness to God that is separating him from everybody else. And Darius is recognizing that. And this is where I'm saying Darius seems to be a king of quality, a king of character. He's not one that is wanting to just promote himself, because he's putting the right people in the right place. And it's evident that Darius is wanting the efficiency of his government to keep improving, because he sees Daniel, he recognizes this asset that he has, and he's using this asset to the best of his ability. He's going to put Daniel into a position where Daniel can do some of the best things, a man of good quality, a man of good character, to put him in second in charge. So you've got this quality man that is right below you to take care of some of these other things. Instead of being over, one of 3 over 120, you're now number 2 over everybody. And Daniel is separating himself from everybody at that point. And at this point in time, the old capital of Babylon had roughly between 200 and 250,000 people, is what I've been finding out, the number of people in just the capital of old Babylon. So if you divide that by 120, you can see roughly what people are in charge. But things are changing, and as the kingdom grows, these satraps are going to be in charge of more people where they're collecting taxes. So it's quite a large area that everybody is in charge of here. And Daniel himself is in charge of the 3 above that. So that's how Daniel is starting under Darius in this new empire that's taken place, the Medo-Persian Empire that overtook the Babylonian Empire. Let's continue on unless somebody's got any questions. Verses 4 and 5. Remember, Daniel's one of the 3 commissioners. Then the commissioners and the satraps began to find ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence or corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." Why would they care? Why would they care if Daniel's doing something right? The only time people care if somebody's doing something right is if they're doing something wrong. And if Daniel's in charge and they're doing something wrong, Daniel's going to hold their feet to the fire. He's going to make them accountable for their actions. They probably didn't like that. And if they weren't doing something wrong and they wanted to do something wrong, they knew they couldn't get it past Daniel. So if they were wanting to skim money off the top, Daniel's a sharp man, a man of good character, he would figure it out and he'd call them on it. If they did do something wrong, Daniel would have figured out and he would have called them on it. So these men were up to no good. His co-workers couldn't find anything wrong with them, and they wanted to, because they wanted to do something that wasn't right. So their faithfulness, their loyalty is definitely not 100% to the king, whereas Daniel's was. He was faithful and loyal to the king. And they figured out that if we can't find anything wrong with Daniel in regards to his government issues, as far as him being in charge of what Darius has put him in charge, where else can we find fault in Daniel? Where else can we find this guy where he'll screw up and do something wrong? Well, let's see if we can do something with his God. Can we put him to test with his God? And that's what they started to do. That's where they're trying to figure out, how can we find and accuse Daniel of something to get this man out of our way, because they wanted to do something that they shouldn't be doing. Don't know how many of the satraps came up to this plan with the commissioners. Don't know if it was both commissioners and all 120. Don't know if it was one commissioner of that. But it says, then the commissioners. So that tells me it was at least two, and there was only three of them, so Daniel wasn't involved in the satraps. So don't know how many have actually tried to find accusation against Daniel, if it was all or just a large handful. But they definitely wanted to do something wrong. They wanted to accuse Daniel of something to get him out of the way, and they just couldn't find it. And they figured out, if we can't find something doing wrong in the government, we'll find something as he's trying to worship and obey his God. And these men were schemers. They were definitely schemers, because they knew who Daniel was, just like the king did, because they were worked with him for a little bit now. They knew what Daniel did. Daniel was a man of habit, and they knew when he would pray. They knew who he'd pray to. They knew how he would pray. Because if you want to take something out of the way, what do? You find out what they do. So they knew what Daniel did. And they knew that if he had to choose between following God or being loyal to the king, what would Daniel do? He'd follow God. He would follow God first, then he would follow the king. He would not break his faithfulness to God. And these men knew that. They knew that Daniel would not break his faithfulness to God. And that is such a great thing to have, if somebody can say that of somebody, that we know when put to the test, you will follow God. And these men knew that of Daniel. If somebody can say that of me, I would be so honored that that is out there, that if Cliff's put to the test, he will follow God versus breaking down and do something else. I mean, that's where we all need to examine our lives and say, would somebody say that of me? And we see that of Daniel. And we see that throughout the whole book. So this isn't just a one instance for Daniel. It's throughout the whole book so far. And if we continue on through the book, we're going to see that. That's the type of person and character Daniel was. That's how he lived his life. He wasn't just a faithful person on Sunday. You know, we show up and we worship God, but what are we when we leave this building? Do we go back to what the world says, or are we a Christian 24/7? Daniel was a Christian 24/7, 365. And these men knew it. And they wanted Daniel out of the way, and the only way to get Daniel out of the way was try to find some fault against him with his God. Continuing on, unless somebody's got questions. You're awful quiet today. Yes, this is one of the stories I was wanting to get to, the lion's den, so don't be quiet so I can get to it. So, any comments? Okay, you're going to let me get there today. What's that? We'll save them, okay. Well, I've only got, 12 pages today, so we'll be fine. Only did 2 verses last week. You're letting me make up for it. Verses 6 through 9. Remember, this is all the buildup for Daniel, this story that we learned as kids about the lion's den. It wasn't that he was just tossed in. Here's the backstory to the lion's den. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement over to the king and spoke to him as follows. I'm reading Daniel 6, verses 6 through 9. King Darius, live forever. Common greeting. We see that. We saw it with Nebuchadnezzar. We're seeing it now with Darius. It's when anybody comes to the king, they're always saying that King so-and-so, live forever. A common greeting for them. All the commissioners of the kingdoms, the prefects, the satraps, and the high officials and the governors have consulted together. So it's just not the commissioners and the satraps. It's the prefects, the high officials, the governors. They've all consulted together. The king should establish a statute, enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document that is the injunction. So it's awful interesting that these men had made their plan. They've gotten together, and it wasn't just the commissioners now and the satraps. They got more high officials involved. They've got some of the prefects involved. So they got more people involved in this. So they're talking to, I'm assuming, their corrupt buddies. If you want to keep doing this, we got to get Daniel out of the way. And here's how we think we can do it. And they all come in and they say, King, here's what you need to do. And they got together and they come with him. And how do you get somebody to do something that's above you in authority to get them to do what you want? You got to make them think it's a good idea. There's got to be a benefit for them, because you got to look at them and it's got to say, what's in it for me? And it's best if you make them think it's their idea. So how can these men get the king to say, this is a good idea, it's going to benefit me, it's my idea? Well, they're not going to get him to say it's my idea, but they're going to get the king to see the benefit for the king. And they're going to make him see how it is a good idea. So you know what you should do? King, you need to make this law. And then, not just law, you need to enforce it. And anyone that makes a petition or prays to a god or man, instead of you, king, because you're the one in authority, you need to have this out there for 30 days. It's just a test. It's not a permanent thing. That's getting the king to buy into it, because if it's a long thing, why would the king want to do it? Of course my subjects are loyal. But it's a 30-day test. We'll just put it out there for 30 days to see if anybody is not loyal to you. If they're going to worship somebody else, make a petition to a god or another man king, not you. And if that happens, just throw them in the lion's den. No big deal. King, who's going to disobey you? So they're getting the king, they're selling it as best as they can to buy into this program, with the intent of strictly going after Daniel. They didn't care about anybody else right now. These men wanted to go after Daniel, and they knew they could get him. And this is how they thought they could get Daniel. They sold this program to the king, selling it as best as they could. King, here's why you should do it. Here's how it's going to benefit you, because you'll see that your subjects are loyal to you, that they're going to be faithful to you and do what you should do. Even though we're conniving little schemers and we're not loyal to you, but this is what you should do, king. And so what happens? They come in and they say, here's what you should do. Oh, by the way, I just happen to have something here that you should sign, and here it is. They had it all ready for him. They basically had the paper there signed with it written down. In 8 it says, now king, establish the injunction and sign the document. We wrote it out for you. You don't have to worry about it. All you have to do is sign it if you agree with this. That's all you have to do. The king didn't have to do nothing. They thought of the plan for him. They thought of the injunction. They thought of the penalty. They thought how good it would be for the king. The king says, yeah, that's a good idea. 30 days, we'll see who's loyal to me. No big deal. After 30 days, it's done. And they also put in there, because according to the Medes and Persians, the law back then, when something is like this in place, even the king cannot revoke it. He cannot make it go away. It's there. So this law, this injunction is there for 30 days. And if the king wanted to, because of the laws of the Medes and Persians back then, the king could not revoke this injunction. It's there. So for 30 days, it cannot be changed. King liked the idea, signed it. Now this is in effect. And can you just see the commissioners and satraps? Got them. Daniel's history. It's just time now. And that's exactly what they wanted. They didn't care about anybody else. They didn't care that whoever else would fall into play here. They strictly wanted Daniel out of their way, and they knew they had it. They knew that Daniel would be loyal to the king until it came up to being loyal to God first. And we're going to read about that next. They got their plot set, and they're ready to spring the trap, because now all they got to do is watch and see what Daniel does. Any comments? Nobody. Man. Well, we're not, we may. But doing the study on this, looking through other scriptures, it's interesting how it parallels so many other stories when things go on. And I'm seeing a lot of this kind of parallels, if we think back to the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how accusations were made against them and how things were happening against Daniel. Yes, Tom?
Just for one comment, you mentioned last week, Esther is sort of in the Medes and the Persian time too. So this story comes up again in the book of Esther.
Yes.
Where the king makes a decree, and there's a different solution in Esther than there is here. But so it's kind of it's a theme that carries through with this particular nation. I just think, as you said this earlier, we're all trapped in the same kind of a scenario usually. Not like Daniel, we're having
Right.
thrown the lines to them. But I'm just thinking, because Hades on my mind with everything that's going on down there. We've been down there so many times that it's like somebody comes in and you think that they want to do what's right for the people, but you find out after the fact they really want to do what's best for them first, and if there's something left over, then they'll kind of help the people. And that's kind of where Daniel was caught here. He's wanting to do, he's being loyal to the king, but he's more loyal to God, and people don't like that. And so, and whether it's in your business or in your country or whatever, I guess we all of us kind of have to watch.
Oh, absolutely.
Or which way are people making decisions and pushing us, or pushing their own agenda, and how is that going to impact us? So here, Daniel, of course, sees it to the largest degree because they want to take his life.
Right.
A lot of times it's not quite that severe, but it can still feel pretty painful. But you find out you're on the wrong side of somebody with more authority, more power, more money, or more this or more that, whatever drives their agenda.
Yep. I'll get to you in just a second. I want to give a sidebar to what Tom just said, what he brought up Haiti. Nothing to do with this lesson. I just found this online. News from Cat Patient. The schools have been closed more days than they've been opened. This is down in Haiti. The international airport has been closed. Food sources are limited and expensive. We think our prices are bad. Now get this one. A gallon of gas is currently $19 US. And a gallon of diesel is currently $15 US. That's the things that are going down on Haiti right now. I mean, and that only comes because I just read that a little bit ago, and like I said, complete sidebar. We think we have it bad sometimes. I spend $50 to fill up my tank. At $19 a gallon, I'm not filling up my tank. It's a complete sidebar, but we continue to need to pray for Haiti and the things that are going on there. It is bad. Sorry, Ted. great comment. Everybody hear all that? I mean, it's the Old Testament, I don't want to say taking care of the physical, whereas the New Testament taking care of the spiritual, but we see the different types of relief and saving.
The Old Testament is the schoolmaster showing what God's going to do, what God will do for his people.
Absolutely. Anything else before we move on? Verses 10 through 15. Now when Daniel knew that this document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had the windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast in the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke to the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king established may be changed. These men definitely had to be talking to each other all the time, because every time they come before the king, they're all in agreement. Okay, we got our story straight. We know what we're going to do. We see that throughout this story with this. But if we start in verse 10, the plot kind of moves from the king's court to Daniel's house. And you know, once the injunction's signed, what did these men do? I've got no doubt that they ran outside and they're looking for Daniel. Well, we've been watching Daniel. This time, he's in his window and he's praying. They're out there looking for him. And Daniel somehow knew that this injunction was signed and passed. I don't believe Daniel was involved in it at all. I don't believe Daniel was anywhere in the king's court when this was going on. Daniel was out doing what he should be doing for the king at that time, is what I believe. Nothing here to support that, but I believe Daniel's doing what Daniel should have been doing. And we see that he knew the law was passed. How he knew, didn't know. But it didn't change his actions. He didn't stop, hesitate, and think, maybe I should just back away from the window, shut the blinds, and just do this kind of quietly. He did what he did all along. Got to the window, got on his knees, went to look toward Jerusalem, and prayed. This injunction the king signed with its penalty didn't faze him one bit. The reason he got on his knees and I looked out the window toward Jerusalem, many people say no real reason. But I found several commentators that are saying that one of the reasons he did that was praying toward Jerusalem, because he knew that God would restore Jerusalem to its former glory. And he knew that that was the direction that Solomon's temple was, and God's presence had resided in that temple, and that someday, even though that temple was destroyed, it would be restored again. Now, is that the reason why Daniel was out looking out his window facing toward Jerusalem? I don't know that for a fact. But some of the commentators and other books I've read, that is one of the reasons that he chose to pray in that direction. And it does make some sense that he would do that. That out of respect for God, knowing that God would restore the temple, that God would restore Jerusalem, that the temple would be built, he's praying in that direction. Is it by chance? Don't know. But that's my belief in that. But whatever the reason, these men knew that Daniel would be looking out a specific window at specific times, and they watched. And they watched as Daniel prayed to his God. And we can see examples of Daniel's prayers in chapter 2 when he praises God for his wisdom and his sovereignty. And then later on in chapter 9 where he's confessing the sins of the people, and he's praying for compassion and mercy for God. So Daniel's prayers aren't little short, one little things that, help me get out of this situation, or pray for, please be with our people. Amen, we're done. He's fervent, reverent prayers, praying for the right things. And he did it without hesitation, knowing what could possibly happen to him. So these men, whether it was a day, 2, 3, 4, 5 days go by, they've got enough evidence of seeing what Daniel's doing. And I'm sure it wasn't just, we see him do it once and we're done. Let's just make sure. In case the king calls us on it, let's make sure we can recount when he's doing it. And they come to the king, and they start reciting back to the king. You made this injunction, right? That if anybody bows down or prays to a god or man other than you for 30 days, they'd be casting the lions in, right? And they get the king to agree to it. They want to make sure the king understands what he did. And by the way, it was from the laws of the Medes and Persians. It can't be revoked, right? Yep. King's agreeing with this. And you can imagine, these men are now, yes, Daniel did it. The king agrees to it. Now we're going to tell him what we saw. Now we're going to tell him it's Daniel. Now we're going to tell him it's his second guy in charge. So when we get to verse 13, they now tell the king that it's Daniel that did it. They didn't come up and say, King, sorry to tell you, it's our third administrator. He must have slipped up. He prayed to his God. I'm sure he's sorry. No. What'd they say? This exile. They're making Daniel look like a bad man. And Daniel didn't do anything wrong. They call him one of the exiles of Judah. He's the one. It's Daniel. He's the one that broke your law. King, he pays no attention to you. He didn't make a mistake. He's paying no attention to you. He's not loyal to you. They're making Daniel look as bad as they can. They got the king to agree to the injunction, got to agree to the penalty, and got to agree that it can't be revoked, and now they sprung the trap that it's Daniel. And when the king heard this, most kings would be, hey, somebody's not loyal to me? No big deal. Off with their head, into the lion's den, throw them in the fiery furnace. We've seen all these things happen. But Darius here, when he heard it, he wasn't the happiest king around at that point. And I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself here. In verse 14, when he heard, he was deeply distressed. I don't believe he was distressed that it was Daniel. I don't think he was upset that he knew that Daniel was being faithful to God. I think he was upset that he's got men under his command that's not loyal to him. Why aren't you guys being like Daniel? Why are you worried about a guy that didn't do anything wrong doing this? Darius knew what type of man Daniel was. Darius knew that Daniel prayed. Darius knew that he was loyal to him. So who's he going to be upset at? He's going to be upset at these men that duped him. These men specifically came in with this injunction, maybe sign it, not thinking about Daniel or somebody else. They duped him. That's what the king's upset about. He's upset about these men that are under his command, should be doing the right thing, duped him to get what they wanted. And now the king, he's trying to get out of this. But he can't. Because under the Medes and Persians law, the king can't revoke this command. We will probably stop here. The last thing I want to bring up is the instance where we're seeing here where the men are saying that Daniel has no disrespect for you, he's not loyal to you. Where did we see that earlier in the chapter? When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were accused of the same thing, that these men have disregarded your command, king. Remember, that's when the king Nebuchadnezzar built the statue, and when all the music played, people were supposed to bow down. They didn't do it. These men were being faithful to God. But Nebuchadnezzar took it a different way. He didn't have to throw them in the fire. He did it anyhow. But yet we know the story of that these men were saved. But at this point, the king realized what happened. He knows he can't change the command. And next week we're going to see, finally, the lion's den, what happens to Daniel at this point. Any questions? Bill?
What was the time frame that you said we were talking about around 5 BC?
Shortly after 539.
Okay. Well, this kind of coincides with
Yes.
So he's praying, and this being done while those kind of.
It's overlapping. I'm not sure if you were here last week. I talked about the Medes in Persian, how Cyrus, who was the main king over everything, was helping finance some of the build of Jerusalem and things like that back then. He had a different heart than what Nebuchadnezzar did. He lets some of the Jews go back to their homeland. But Daniel decided, for whatever reason, to stay at this point. But yes, these two stories are overlapping at the same time. Yes. There, yeah.
He sent the second wave over because Cyrus sent the first one.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. Yeah, you're right on point. But these two books got some parallels going on at the same time. Yes, Ted.
The idea that Daniel prayed to, towards Jerusalem isn't unusual, but Drew is right to say that that was done quite a little bit. And it's because Samuel, not Second Chronicles.
It's Chronicles.
Well, in Kings, First Kings also, David's son, when he dedicated the temple, his prayer was that your eyes may be open towards this temple day and night, for the sake of that your name will be, that you may hear the prayer which your servants make for this place. You may hear the supplication of your servants and the people Israel, when they pray towards this place, here in heaven, your dwelling place, and your ear. So, I think it's more than that, there's a couple of
What's
places.
this?
Chronicles chapter 6 also has a verse almost like that.
They pray toward the temple.
They play towards the temple. And Daniel's doing this even though the temple's destroyed. And we see stories of, like 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles where the people faced Jerusalem, faced the temple area, and did pray. And that's one of the reasons I'm believing that Daniel was praying out the window that
Jewish people still do that today, the ones that are conservative and believers, and so do Muslims.
Muslim. Yep. Great comments. Anything else? See y'all next week.